I get advanced reading copies, and oftentimes I get duplicates, so I'm always happy to give one away when we do an
got
event.
some good blurbs there. So
Yeah. Good. Wonderful. Thank you so very much. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. This is our first live event. No, is it our first with Heather? It's my first live event with you.
It's been a while. Yes, it's been
or was my
several
memory
years. No,
terrible?
it's been several years. So I'm so happy to be back.
Well, we're delighted to see
Yes.
you. So Heather has, I assume, family here?
Yes, I do.
Right.
I have my two sisters and my brother-in-law and my best friend from elementary school who's
Oh,
here.
wonderful.
So, yeah.
Right. So Iowa
Mother
lives.
folks. So,
Right.
yeah.
So Heather's book comes actually in two formats. It comes out in a hardcover edition for libraries and bookstores, and a paperback edition, which is sort of an interesting way to be publishing. But I like it because I think it covers all price ranges and tastes and so forth. Lots of people would rather carry one around and beat it up in their purse or pocket. So anyway, this is a book called The Overnight Guest, and it's set in Iowa. It's really set in Iowa. So I think a question, Heather, would be, since you are writing about a particularly vicious murder and a cold case that comes back to life, is a rural setting, why an urban setting, a rural setting compared to an urban setting, and how do you see the difference?
Yeah, well, I think, for me, I love writing about Iowa. I love writing about small towns, rural communities. So that is just kind of what I enjoy doing. But I think especially for this project, The Overnight Guest, having it set in a remote location was really important for the story. So it's set on a farm that's out in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. And so that kind of lends itself to that isolation of feeling, alone and not having anybody around. And then you add to it, like I did, the blizzard, and that even adds more layers of isolation and being removed from the outside world.
Well, I think, so much crime fiction is set in urban communities, and, they seem so dangerous, the city rife with the possibilities of harm and so forth. But then we see in this book that the country can be just as dangerous, or possibly even more so. It reminded me of that awful true crime event that actually happened in Kansas, the name of which, of course, I can't remember. But remember, there was a brutal murder on a farm in Kansas. It was quite a famous case.
It was the Cutters. Maybe?
Starkweather? Does that sound right? Patrick.
Patrick,
we use the chat function. This is the moment at which Patrick types in on the Zoom. It comes up and it says, sorry, honey, what was the crime in Kansas that, that very brutal rural crime where there was... Might have been. Why do I think does Starkweather ring a bell? Remember Alex Kava wrote something along those lines.
Dirk Baretsky wrote a book about the Bloody Bender family.
Maybe that was it.
They would lure travelers, solitary travelers and drifters.
I read about that, and they would come in and never leave.
Yeah, but there was another one where there was a slaughter in a farmhouse and, the whole bit. So, the only point I'm making is that you can be just as much at risk in the countryside as you can be in the city. And I think that the sense of isolation that you create in this book is a really important part of how the plot unfolds and how the characters react and so forth. So I assume that you yourself were familiar with all this.
Well, I don't live in a tiny community, but of course I'm really familiar and have family in small communities. And you can definitely go out into the countryside and not have a neighbor for miles, and throw a blizzard on top of that, and then lose cell phone coverage and internet coverage, and you're completely isolated.
All those things that crime writers today have to do, you have to disable
to find a
the
way,
phone and the internet. You have to go to really extremes in order to remove those.
That's right.
Technology has given us new plot ideas, but it's absolutely wrecked a bunch. For example, the Lost Air plot, there have been several lately. There's absolutely no way that today somebody could arrive and say, hey, I'm your illegitimate son from, Taiwan or something. I mean, that whole plot
Right,
is,
right.
completely gone. But I do think it's a constant challenge for, an author to write a contemporary novel and have to remove not, I mean, it's not just the weather and the countryside, but you also have to get rid of the tech in order to make
Yeah,
these people
yeah,
truly
and that was
isolated.
really important for this story as well, and for the story to unfold the way it needed to. But interestingly, it does happen. So I live in Cedar Rapids, Iowa now, and I guess it was over a year ago, we had a bad storm, the derecho, it was called. It was a terrible wind, and it totally it destroyed much of the city and parts of Iowa. And there was no cell phones for many people, no internet for weeks for people. So it does happen. So I thought, well, maybe I'm pushing it a little bit, but it is possible.
Indeed, it is.
Yeah.
Of course, I think in Iowa that you would have people lost in the cornfield. I'm from Chicago, but my father was from Perry, Iowa.
Yeah.
So the whole Midwestern thing. But you could be really isolated in a lost in the corn stalks.
That's happened. That's happened.
Kind of like the Appalachian Trail, where people would wander off into the rhododendron hills, and and I mean, seriously, children died, excuse me, and so forth, and could be right off the trail, but because it was so impenetrable, nobody could find them. I suppose today that you attach beacons to your children like you do to your dogs, and so if they wander off the trail, there's some kind of geo alert.
Yeah.
Anyway, there have been a number of mystery novels published in the last year involving podcasts, particularly true crime podcasts, and how that inspires whoever's running the podcast, or people listening to it, or people who decide they're going to be deputized as a result of listening to it, the kind of Kyle, whatever his name is, kind of a thing. But this case, it's a true crime author. Yay, a book, not a podcast.
Yeah.
I was really pleased. And she this is her fourth book that she's working on, but she is not able to really get into her story, her reconstruction, unless she understands the landscape. Is that that's the position that you wrote?
She's lured there, and she's Wylie Lark is the true crime author, and her life back home in the Pacific Northwest isn't easy. She has some conflicts with her ex-husband and some estrangement with her teenage son, and so she just feels like she needs to get away, finish this book, tie up some loose ends there, and hunker in and complete the book. So she travels to Iowa in order to do this.
All right, and when she's there, she winds up staying longer than she intended, partly because maybe to go home to face her difficult teenage son is not high on her list.
Not easy.
I can understand that. For those of us who had teenagers and ex-husbands, don't want to do that. But also, there's something about this place that really grips her. About what's the name of the town? Because even the town.
Yeah, the name of the town is Burton, and which in itself has so many layers to it, and it's fictional, a fictional Iowa town. All the towns in my books are fictionalized, but if you're from Iowa, like we have some people here in the audience, you might recognize some of the places. So they're fictionalized, but so Burton, the 20 years before, in the town there was this terrible crime in this farmhouse, and so really the book is the Overnight Guest is a book within a book. And so we have the storyline of Wylie, who travels there to finish her book, and comes across a young child in the snow, brings the child in, and then that's interwoven with the book that she writes. And so as readers, you learn what happened, the crime that really shook this community, how it affected the victims and their families, as well as the police procedural involved in that as well.
Plus, there's a dog.
There is a dog.
Always
There's always a dog
in a crime novel.
Yeah,
And the dog.
Always a dog.
The dog and Wylie have kind of an uneasy relationship. It's a bit of a standoff.
Yes.
She's not too crazy about the dog.
The dog adopted her.
Right. And
Right.
so it's the dog that goes out, in the cold and the dark to pee. and doesn't come back, that drags Wylie out of the farmhouse. And what does the dog find? Because this is the
Yeah.
opening of the book, so
Yeah,
we're not
right. We're
spoiling
not
anything here
spoiling
for you.
anything. No, so yeah, she goes out and discovers that there's this child laying in the snow, and again, they're in the middle of nowhere. So she is just flabbergasted at how the child could end up on her front doorstep or up beyond her front doorstep in this kind of weather, because it's blizzarding, it's below zero, it's bitter cold. So of course she brings the child in, and Wylie is kind of prickly. So just like her relationship with the dog that adopted her, she isn't sure how to react with who this child is, and trying to figure out where the child came from, why they're there, and they have a rocky start as well.
Very rocky start. And he's too little to really understand hypothermia, but he's out there, frozen to the ground, and his clothes are wet and so forth. And she wants to take them off and warm him up, put him in the dryer and all. He's not having any of that. And then off he goes.
Yeah.
So lots of questions
Yeah.
as we are in this early stages of the book. Are you a person who carefully thinks ahead to each step in the story, or do you just sort of kick it into gear and then wait and see what happens?
Yeah, I kick it into gear. I have a general idea. I had the premise for the book, of course, and had a general idea of the characters and where I wanted the story to go, but it takes off in its own direction every single time I write a book. So I don't outline, I don't plot things out. I settled on the perspectives that I wanted to do and the characters, and started writing. And so I call it writing ugly. I get everything out on the page, and then in the revision process, I come back and I do what I think is the really hard work of mining that material for something that's good out of there.
Well, we can't talk about how this book plays out, unfortunately, because
No.
it's really interesting. But I think a reasonable question would be, even if you don't have a roadmap, do you have the end game? Because it'd be pretty hard to bring this solution off, the conclusion of this book off, if you didn't know something about it when you start.
Well, interestingly, and this happens to me typically, I have an idea, and then the characters take me in a completely different direction. So how I thought it was going to end and who the bad person is changed as I wrote the book. And so, of course, that means going back and making lots of adjustments earlier, but it was better for the story, and it made more sense in the end for it to happen that way. And yeah, my characters tend to kind of take over as I write, which is okay, because they seem to know what they're doing more than I do sometimes. So
I know it sounds so woo-woo, doesn't it? It's actually just your subconscious, but nonetheless, I certainly, it's interesting because, in talking to writers, which I do every day, essentially, how different the process is for different writers. Some are meticulous outliners, some have absolutely no clue what they're doing, and just sort of let it develop. And I often think, maybe I don't know how you wrote your first novel, but my experience listening to people is that whatever worked for them the first time is what they stick with, because there was a success. And there's a certain amount of superstition then that creeps in, well, if I did it that way and it worked, if I change it, maybe it'll be a disaster.
That's very true. Yeah, I think I've written all my novels that way, where I, have the idea, just settle on the characters, but those change as well. I've had books where characters had a whole perspective throughout the book, and by the end they're out. They didn't make the final cut. And that does seem to work for me. I'm not sure why. I've tried to be more methodical in plotting stories out, but that's not worked for me. So I go back to what I know, which is just sit down and start writing.
Oh, you've written a lot of books, so you have more confidence now that, it'll actually succeed. I would think the first time to do it like that would be pretty terrifying, surely.
Yeah, it would be, but I didn't know what I was doing.
Oh,
so I didn't
well,
know
there you are.
I didn't know to be scared.
Right.
So
And the other good news is when you're writing your first book, who really knows?
nobody.
Maybe your sisters or something, but there's not a contract, there's not any pressure. I mean, it's a well-known thing that most writers have the hardest time writing their second book, and the second book very often is the one that is the least successful. And a lot of that is because having had an infinity of time to write a first book and just enjoy it now, suddenly the reality is you've got like X number of months to produce the second book. So the really lucky writers are the ones that, wrote several books that didn't sell, and when they finally sell one, they have material they can go back to,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's not like, you have to steal a case from somebody,
Yeah.
which is actually the subject of a famous lawsuit in regard to one author whose name I won't reveal, but in desperation actually did steal an open case from a police department because there was no plot. So fortunately you spared yourself that.
Yes, I did.
Right.
did.
I had some other great question I was going to ask you. So fill in the, right. What interested you about making her a true crime author? Have you written true crime at all?
I haven't, but I'm one of those people who's kind of obsessed with true crime. I mean, I listen to all the I do. I listen to all the podcasts. I watch the documentaries, read the books, and I thought, well, I have, some great admiration for true crime. Michelle McNamara, who wrote I'll Be Gone in the Dark, who
Almost finished it, right?
almost finished it, but
Yeah,
sadly
she
passed
died,
away.
sadly.
Yeah, I just was so enthralled by her writing in that book. But I'm a fiction writer, so I thought, I don't write nonfiction. I don't write true crime, but I can have a true crime writer be my main character, and so I kind of got the best of both worlds with that.
That is, I
Yeah.
think, Patrick is our true crime guy. Patrick, what is it that makes you so drawn to true crime? Because we have a number of events coming up that Patrick does, because Sarah Weinman, for example, a book called Scoundrel.
Yeah, I read that. That's great.
Oh,
a great
good.
book. Yeah.
Okay, and some other stuff. What is it that fascinates you? I know I'm putting you on the spot, but
I mean, I don't know. I think true crime has really undergone a sort of renaissance or reinvention, where books like The Devil in White City and I'm trying to think of help me folks. I'm trying to think of some other examples that are. It's not the salacious John Benet Ramsey.
well, there's In Cold Blood and some of the classics. I think some of it is that, you remember we did an event with an author who does a true crime podcast. And part of his event was that he wanted to encourage everybody in the audience to participate in crime solving by, checking video, and had a success in Chicago, I think it was, with, I don't remember whether it was a mugging or something. It wasn't an actual murder, if I recall right. And because everybody has phones now and, stuff is all being recorded, he ended up pulling together or appealing to people who might have had some kind of knowledge of the crime or recording or something or other. So you wind up with this kind of sea of amateur deputized, or not deputized, but you know what I mean, people. And so I think it's become participatory is what I'm trying to say. I think there's a sense of a community can work on solving some of these crimes thanks to all this technology and so forth that we have. It's almost impossible, some places like in England, it's almost impossible to do anything without being recorded on CCTV. If any of you watch Line of Duty, for example, they've got cameras, they can check absolutely everything, where you walked, where you drove. They can locate your position, they can access your phone records. Yeah. So I do think that there's a sort of a movement towards community solving, and maybe true crime podcasts have accelerated in interest and all that.
It makes me wonder. Yeah, I think it's just really boomed, and I say I'm fascinated, but we always know there's true victims and their families involved. But I think we do kind of relate to that wondering of wanting justice, wanting something to be solved, closure for families. And so I think we're drawn to that.
Well, some true crime, it relates to crimes that were never solved. And so the author, can hypothesize or try to. Did you all read about the Anne Frank book, for example, where somebody did a big study and think they determined who it was that betrayed Anne Frank in Amsterdam? The publisher, I think the Dutch publishers had been forced to pull the book over some kind of controversy. But so there's the unsolved true crime, and then there's where how it all came out, and then it's more, kind of like a documentary or something. Goes ways, but I can see why, because a lot of us read mysteries just to see if we can beat the puzzle. So that kind of true crime thing would be fun. The other thing Heather mentioned that I think is important for you as readers to know is that the book that you end up getting is not necessarily the book, at least at the beginning, that the author was writing. That books go through this big evolutionary process, and you catch it when it's finished, but along the way, all kinds of different changes can happen. As you point out, it can be a different it can be a different bad guy. It can be, characters that don't make the cut. I love that. It's like casting.
Yes, and it's true. And each book is very different, of course. But like my early readers here, I have several of them here, 3 of them here. It's a completely different book than what I started with, and that's kind of the way I roll. I just, it never ends up being the same book, but it's really a journey. I go right along with the characters on that journey, so I get great feedback from early readers, make changes, and get it into good enough shape. We can send it to my editor, and we have lots of conversations going back and forth, and things are changed and adjusted and cut and added, and finally this final product appears. So
well, it is your book, so you get to make the final decisions. But
correct.
Do any of your early readers really argue for a different result?
No, I don't think nobody argues, but I think, I'll ask for specific feedback. Like, is this suspenseful enough? Is the pace fast enough? And I get super feedback. So.
But you don't say, should it be Joe or should it be Charlie?
Yeah, no, I don't
like,
do that so much.
Years ago, there was a play called The Mystery of Edwin Drood on Broadway. Edwin Drood is the book that Dickens died while he was writing it, so it's unfinished, and you don't know what the actual solution to it was. And a really wonderful playwright did a Broadway production, and I went to see it. And the way they did it is the play followed the book up until the point where Dickens died, and then each of the characters came out and lobbied the audience for being the murderer. It was fabulous.
Wow,
they each
fun.
came out and they made a case. No, it was me. No, it was over here. It was me. It was, Mrs. Scarlett in the library, whatever it all is. And then the audience voted. And whoever won the audience that night, then they went on with the play. And that was the solution. That was the bad guy. So every time the play was performed, it was basically different, depending on the feedback
Choose your own adventure.
from the audience. I just thought it was so, I was really lucky to see it one time, but
Exciting.
I thought, what a really good idea, to have that kind of back and forth with the audience, because it really invested you in the outcome. You're going, no, it's my guy, and then you had to settle for wherever it was, and then, the actors had to convince you that that was really the right solution.
Right.
But I suppose it doesn't really work that way with a novel, does it?
Not
Too
quite.
bad. Right.
Yeah.
So, anybody have questions they would like to ask Heather?
So how many books have I read? I've read, this is my 9th novel. Yeah.
And you're on average, what, every 12 or 18 months?
18 months about, yes.
Well, there's no right or wrong. It's
No.
actually whatever contract you make with your publisher about how long you can take would be it. Yeah.
What's the hardest part for you during?
The hardest part for me, it's different again with each project, but I think the most daunting part for me is, going back into that deep revision when, you have this thing in front of you. And like I said, I write ugly. I get it all on the page, going in and mining it for what needs to stay and what needs to go. And it's hard for me as a writer to cut things and, leave things on the cutting room floor because, you work hard for those words, but especially in thriller writing, pace is so important. So you have to keep things moving. So you have to know what should stay, what should go, what keeps the story moving forward. And so for me, I would say that's the most angsty part for me is having to go back in and cut things and change things like that.
So you have in the back of this book a
Mhm.
preview of your next book called Not a Sound. And I wanted to, I don't think that your gender determines the gender of your characters,
Mhm.
but I mean, I really hate this idea that, if it's a man, you can't write women or
Right.
vice versa and so forth. But do you tend to write towards women's stories where women are the protagonists?
I write most of my books from multiple perspectives.
Mhm.
But I have written in male perspectives. I think it just depends on where the story's going. And, I think I'm drawn to women's stories, but I also feel like that male voice often needs to be in there as well to tell the story. So I enjoy doing that, adding those perspectives.
And if
as
you
well.
do that, is violence towards women something, a social issue that really interests you?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that's, it is an important social issue. It's something that's been around for forever. But I think more so than that is just empowering. I'd like to write strong women and who find their way through difficult situations, and they dig deep for those resources inside themselves. And people go through hard times and difficult times, but finding a way out of it. So I do write dark and complicated stories, but I also like to infuse a sense of hope into them as well.
So you have some real action. There's a really long action scene in this book. Do you block that out in your head? Are you good at visualizing how people move in space in order for you to choreograph the scene?
That is really important to me. I think I am a pretty visual person, and so as I'm writing, I'm picturing that, I'm imagining it. Once I get well into a book, I'll create maps of the town and the area of where things would happen, and that really helps me as well, just that frame of reference. But yeah, I do. I don't plot it out, but when I sit down to write a certain scene, I definitely it's very visual for me.
Well, right. I mean, if you're
yeah.
going to have a big fight scene, you have to envision the place, and then you have to,
Right.
move people around in it and determine how they move. I mean, it's really funny. I reviewed this book to talk to her night after binging on Reacher with my husband last night,
Oh,
5
yeah?
episodes. Rob really got caught up in the whole thing. And Lee, by the way, has an Alfred Hitchcock moment in Reacher, which
I
is
heard
really
about
fun.
that,
Yes,
yeah.
he does. Very brief, and
Yes.
it's over coffee, but nonetheless. But anyway, at the very end, it's like a John Wayne Western, where everything kind of dies down, and then this, he survives, so I'm not spoiling it for you. And then this enormous, guy looms up in the doorway. But prior to that, there was an enormous fight scene with, fire going on and all the rest of it. And I wondered how long they blocked it, the actors and the director, the cameraman, everybody else, to get all of that to work. So it's not hilarious that somebody's gun's pointing the wrong way, or a guy falls into the vat, and drowns, or whatever might be going on. It must be a lot of work to do that.
It is. Yeah, you have to really think and imagine how the characters are going to move, have your scene, and to make things move smoothly. Yeah.
And I will give a plug for the woman in Reacher, because if there is a woman who's truly empowered, she's little, I know, but I mean, and she's furious with him when he tries to protect her,
Yeah.
because she feels like, her job being an office cop and so forth,
Yep.
she can look after herself. And I thought, in a way, while the Reacher thing is really about this, invincible giant male and all the rest of it, this woman actually stole Reacher, and made a great case for female empowerment,
Yeah, absolutely.
which I thought was great. Anybody else have a question or a comment they'd like to make? Now, come on, guys, don't just.
There's a question from one.
Oh, great.
It's just, did you always want to write mystery or
Mhm,
thriller
mhm.
novels?
Yeah, I've always been drawn to mysteries and thrillers ever since I was
Yeah?
a kid. Yeah. So one thing my dad and I used to do, back when we had like 3 stations on TV, they're Friday night movies
Right.
or whatever, and there'd be a
ABC,
mystery movie or
CBS,
something,
and NBC,
and
right?
maybe PBS, and so we would watch those kind of creepy, scary shows. And as I got older, then I picked up the books, that he would be reading. And so we've always shared that kind of love for thrillers and mysteries. And I've always been a reader, of course, and want to be the person to solve the mystery, just like we were talking about earlier. And so I love reading books like that. So that was always my goal, just to write something where readers can be immersed and try to solve the mystery and get swept away.
So many writers are advised that they should write a book they want to read,
Absolutely.
which I think is slightly better than saying write what you know,
I agree.
because sometimes writing what you don't know is even more interesting.
Right.
But a book you want to read. So do you have any, I won't ask you about current authors because you have a whole web of people and you can't possibly include them all, but older authors when you read when you were younger that you particularly liked?
Sure. Well, for me, and this isn't mystery or thriller, but my all-time favorite book of all time is My Antonia by Willa Cather. Absolute favorite book. I reread every year. I just love the way that the setting becomes a character in her books, and especially that one for me. And I strive to do that with my books, have the setting be so powerful that it just becomes a character in the book. So she's one of my favorites. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so many thriller writers that I love. I know, Lee Child, I share that love with my dad, those books. C.J. Bach's books, love those as well. Growing up, I read just about everything. My dad had a lot of Louis L'Amour books, so read those, and Stephen King back in the days, his early books, I would sneak those off the shelf too, and get my hands on those. So
I think really one of the things that makes long-running mystery series so popular and enduring is the landscape. It can be historical, like Elizabeth Peters writing about Egypt and Egyptology. It can be Tony Hillerman writing about the Navajo, or it can be Robert Parker in Boston. But the place is a character, as you say, and it's along with the protagonist is the continuing character too.
Right. And I think you just had Jonathan Kellerman on.
He did. Yeah, we did his book launch on Tuesday.
He was one of what I remember reading his first book and just absolutely enthralled with that.
I did ask him if he were ever going to, because he and Faye have a place in Israel now part-time, if he was ever going to do another book like The Butcher's Theater, because, the Alex Delaware are all set in Los Angeles. And he said no, he thought that he had said everything he could say about Israel, and he didn't know it well enough, to do that. But many people really love The Butcher's Theater more than other things that he's written. So, that's kind of fun as well. And one of the great things going on now, it's so expensive to pay for translation, but increasingly as the mystery genre, the crime genre, has taken root in other countries and other cultures, because it was basically a British and American kind of invention. But now every country practically has its own crime writers and its own, and so more and more books are coming into into English and into American publishing that are written in other countries and being translated. So now we have an opportunity to, we can be in a Swedish village, or we can be in Japan in a coastal city or whatever. It's been a godsend during COVID when you couldn't travel at all. So I was just looking in the March newsletter that I'm writing, so I'm always a couple weeks ahead of you guys. And there's a great book about New Zealand, and there's another one in Denmark, and it's really fun, to see all that happening. And those are written by a New Zealand author and a Danish author, not an American author, thinking about writing about another country.
Right.
So I think that's great.
Yeah.
But you're authentically Iowa, so
It's true.
there we go. Great. Well, thank you all very much for
Yeah,
coming this
thank
evening.
you. Yeah,
I'm
this was a
going
lot
to
of
ask Heather if she'd like to move to this little round table behind. If you'd like to get your book signed or visit with her, please do. And that's all I can say.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you for coming.
Get your pen if you would like.
Wonderful. Yeah.
You can unplug it.